Okay, just wait maybe a minute before we begin. For anyone joining now, I give you greetings from the Middle Kingdom in China. I live in Shanghai, and it's 4 a.m. But I'll say good afternoon to you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and begin. I want to offer a thank you for everyone joining. Also, I want to thank LSU Press for this opportunity to talk about my new book, American Socialist, Laurence Gronlund and the Power Behind Revolution. I have three things that I want to do in the first half of our talk. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the book, first of all. Number two, I want to talk, of course, a little bit about Laurence Gronlund and specifically his version of socialism in the late 19th century. And if time permits, I think it will. I think we will have time. Number three, I want to kind of talk about what's the relevance of this study, a study like this on our age today. So let me talk first of all about the origin of the book. I'm an intellectual and cultural historian of America's long 19th century. My PhD from the University of California focused on the origins of immediate anti-slavery in the early republic. My dissertation was eventually revised into my first book, which was also published by LSU Press, To Preach Deliverance to the Captives. And if I could just say, make a positive note, it's been a wonderful experience working with the staff at LSU. And so American Socialist, as I said, is my second book. I completed my dissertation in 2008, just a few months before the Great Recession. Now, on a purely intellectual level, I had been trained in New Left Marxism and critical theory in grad school, but it was really the recession that really took hold of me on an existential level. So with both my sort of intellectual and research interests, but also my experience, it became, and it has become, quite difficult to ignore the impact of capitalism on really all of life, including key social institutions in the United States that have kind of adopted a capitalist cultural habits, at least in the current neoliberal form. Now, I've been grateful for employment, though never a tenure track position, but I continue to work in the area of history of social movements in the United States, anti-slavery, women's rights, the labor movement, and then of course anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. And at the start of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement in 2011, I organized a course on the history of American radicalism. I also jumped into what one historian has called the newish world of the history of capitalism, and there I could kind of explore the place of slavery and the developments of American capitalism. And I also moved into late 19th century explorations in the kind of philosophical and intellectual developments of socialism, anarchism, communism in the US in the Gilded Age and progressive era. And one individual that stood out was Laurence Gronlund, but he stayed with me for. I was intrigued with this character, someone who had an influence on a number of social reformers, leftists, progressives, radicals, etc. So that's sort of the broad context in which this book came out. But historians also talk about like immediate factors that lead to a particular moment, and it wasn't. I don't know if I should be proud to admit this or embarrassed. It wasn't until Donald Trump's last State of the Union address in his first term that I felt compelled to write about this figure. So, what did Trump say that motivated me? Well, the one thing that he said that Marxism is on the rise in the United States. To a certain degree, he's right. Sales of the Communist Manifesto skyrocketed after the Great Recession. Writers like Joyce Appleby and Eric Hobsbawm and others have said whenever there's an economic downturn, I mean a significant economic downturn, Marx always sort of comes on the scene. Now, of course, a sale of a book is not necessarily indicative that people are absorbing Marx's ideas, but it's nonetheless something to think about. But the second thing, right after Trump said that Marxism is on the rise, he followed it up with repeating kind of a familiar myth, that is the myth of American exceptionalism. Trump suggested that America is sort of by its essence or physical nature, although I don't think Trump would even be able to spell the word metaphysical, but by its sort of metaphysical nature is all about freedom and not socialism. And of course, this is within the context of something that fuels the right in America, and that is this fear of the left, the fear of Marxism. And I'm reminded of years ago, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek had a debate with Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is known for also talking about this fear of Marxism and the takeover of the left and this powerful, this specter haunting, if you will. And Zizek, in a discussion with him, said, where are these Marxists? Where are these Marxists? I don't see them. So, people like Donald Trump, he doesn't know his history. And no neo-fascist leader that he is really interested in getting into history. Now, we should also constructively criticize those leaders in the US who appeal to the social democracy of places like Northern Europe. This too suggests that socialism is kind of a foreign import, essentially un-American. But again, history will tell us that there was a rich, robust, and dynamic left in the U.S. That I would trace back to the 1820s when Robert Owen gave a speech, a very long speech, to a joint session of Congress over the importance of social cooperation. And when I sent so I was motivated to write this. I sent a prospectus to the general editor of LSU, and one of his first comments was, "This work is a well-timed work." So That's the origin of the book. Number two, let me talk a little bit about Gronlund himself and his own version of socialism, specifically what he took from Karl Marx, as well as what he left behind, and then maybe in the process, I can point to you certain sections, certain chapters of the book, without giving too much away. So Laurence Gronlund moved to the United States from Denmark. He was from Denmark. He studied law at the University of Copenhagen. He practiced law in the United States, in Illinois, and he also taught German for a time. He eventually gave up his law practice because he got tired of kind of the defending the bourgeois property, essentially. He became a labor organizer in St. Louis in 1877 during the great strike of that year. He went to jail, but the charges against him really didn't stick. But this certainly had a profound impact on him. And he then devoted himself to writing about the negative social consequences of industrial capitalism, but also sort of traveling the world, speaking from coast to coast, and visiting workers and things like that. And like I said earlier, his activism and his published works profoundly influenced individuals like J.A. Wayland, W.D.P. Bliss, and George Herron, who are also kind of like the precursors to the social gospel movement. May Wood, a great intellectual and student of Richard Ely. And then, of course, one of the most important figures in American history and also in the left, Eugene V. Debs. So what was at the heart? What were some of the basic tenets of Gronlund's socialism? Well, first of all, he affirmed workers owning the means of production. This is kind of a common defining feature that runs through the variations of socialist ideas. But number two, he had a very simple definition of socialism that you can find among other socialists as well, and that is simply cooperation. In this latter sense of cooperation, he was very critical of class warfare as a means to advance toward the collective commonwealth, as he called it. Violence obviously contradicted cooperation. It was not the proper route towards the collective commonwealth. Another feature of his socialism was that he made much of surplus value. This is kind of like the main feature of capitalism. We might say the distinctive feature of capitalism, the idea that workers produce far more than what they receive, not just in terms of wages, but also in terms of social recognition and power. That additional value created in terms of extra hours worked in the course of a day was taken as profit by the capitalists, and that continues today. In short, you could think of capitalist profit as that which someone else created, but that is taken by the capitalist. And by taking that surplus as profit, Gronlund used the term fleecing. And so this is a kind of standard Marxist critique. Gronlund is introducing for the first time to the American public Marxist critique of capital. And you can read about this particularly in chapter 1 of American Socialist. But most importantly, this is something that I emphasize throughout the book, is that Gronlund postulated a divine force, a power moving and directing history, or really evolution. And he says clearly that socialism is really just a philosophy of history. Now, by evolution, we should note that Gronlund was early on quite attracted to the evolutionary organicism, but not the individualism, of Herbert Spencer, arguably the most popular thinker following Darwin in the late 19th century. Now, Gronlund would eventually come to have some pretty negative views on Spencer, but an important part of Gronlund's idea of the divine power shaping events, he called it the power behind evolution. You'll notice in my subtitle, I have the power behind revolution, and I'll get to that in a moment. But these were, in the process of these evolutionary developments, the power behind evolution, or he also called it the will of the universe, would raise up certain individuals, leaders, intellectuals, to move society closer to the commonwealth. And an example of this comes in chapter 2 of the book, where I explore Gronlund's history of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution influenced many people on the left, socialists, anarchists, and communists. And he privileges the French revolutionary thinker Danton as the this sort of figure raised up by the will of the universe to guide people towards a collective commonwealth. Now, a good portion of Gronlund's organicism and sort of his move away from Spencer was the way in which he echoed, almost word for word, Hegel's idealism. And let me offer a few examples. I've already said that, Gronlund was attracted to these world historical figures raised up by the absolute, but who could discern the will of the universe. So like what Hegel says about Napoleon, the world spirit riding upon horseback, Gronlund says something similar about Danton. Also in Gronlund's concept of revolution, he uses a metaphor, almost the exact metaphor that Hegel uses in the phenomenology. And this metaphor, as I said, relates to a revolution. A revolution is like a pregnancy and giving birth, right? So a revolution builds, it's kind of slow, it's gradual, it's evolutionary, right? And then there's this like quick traumatic birth. And you could see his discussion of this in chapter 2. Like I said, this is almost word for word what Hegel talks about in terms of historical development, or the metaphor that Hegel uses in the opening pages of the phenomenology. Gronlund also had a Hegelian view when it came to humans, particularly humans understanding or coming to know their nature, their essence, from within the context or within relation to other human beings. The growth of the consciousness of the individual human, and that part of that growth was by cooperation, was a growing into a larger community of human consciousness. And this uniting with humanity was concurrently coming into the being and the consciousness of the spirit or the mind of God. So they're sort of one and the same. And again, you could see in chapter 4 Gronlund talks about, the consciousness of man is the consciousness of God, and you could see something similar. I'm not quite doing it justice to Hegel at this point, but you see something similar in Hegel. Now, all of this can be seen. The religious aspect of Gronlund's work can be seen throughout all of his works. But what I try to do is I try to trace the maturing of that development. And so chapter 4 really just focuses on the will of the universe. Now, Gronlund wasn't all idealism. There were a sort of tangible, practical, but also contradictory, or we might say dialectical developments within historic capitalism, and developments that were unique in the context of the United States. So chief among them was Gronlund's discussion of the trust. Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts and others. The trust was a strategy whereby corporations cooperated with one another to maximize wealth. Some intellectuals today on the left will talk about there is socialism in America, but it's socialism for big wealth. Now, Gronlund believed that workers would recognize the success of the trust and that they would harness the power of the trust through things like trade unionization or just union activity. Again, if the trust worked for the owners, it would have to work also for the producers. And eventually, according to history, the trajectory of history or the direction of the will of the universe, all trusts would kind of coalesce into one big national trust. And so Gronlund was critical of those who would become known as trust busters. He thought it was foolish to try to destroy the trust because this was a necessary part of the dialectic of history. It's also important to note that the trust influenced Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward. And you could see in chapter 1, kind of a long quotation from Bellamy's Looking Backward, right? So Gronlund had an impact on Bellamy's nationalism as well. There were also practical strategies that Gronlund suggested, and you could see this in chapter 5 in his very last book, more of a practical layout of how we can get to, how the United States can get to, or at least closer to the collective commonwealth. And some of the strategies that he talks about, things like universal education, income tax, public banks, public saving banks. These things are echoed in the Communist Manifesto as well. So there's kind of a close parallel there. Now, there's some things that Gronlund did not deal with. One of the things that he didn't deal with was commodities, or in particular, the commodity fetish. That's how Marx opens his greatest work, Capital, on the commodity and the commodity fetish. And related to that, Gronlund doesn't explore the idea of alienation. Now, alienation is found in Marx's 1844 manuscripts. These weren't published until 1932, but I think the concept of alienation certainly helps us understand better the Communist Manifesto, German ideology, and of course, Capital. I do think there is a kind of alienation or hints at alienation, though Gronlund doesn't use the word, in that humanity or individuals are separated from other individuals, and this is the result of capitalism. He's right about this, or the ways in which individual meaning comes by modes of social relation, um, or how our individual identity, you can't have an identity without being in relation with another. So humans are separated um, from who they are because they're separated from other humans. Um, so, and also, as we said, that this human to human alienation is also an alienation from the divine. So I think, we seriously misunderstand Marx's idea of communism when we ignore alienation. Um, and this might be the reason why Gronlund was so adamantly opposed to communism. For Marx, communism is, in essence, humanity overcoming estrangement, a kind of return to the self, right? What Marx calls a positive supersession of a particular form of property, not general property, but bourgeois property. Communism, Marx says, is a complete return of man to himself as social. And Gronlund rejected communism because it was simply a matter of equitably redistributing all property. Well, Marx was clear about this. He called that, quote, crude communism, right? And so I'm reminded of this when, those that say, oh, Marxism is all about just redistributing uh, unearned property. On the one hand, Marx says, well, no, it's not redistributing uh, uh, property and resources because the capitalists are the ones that are taking everything. But also, this general redistribution of property is crude communism, as he says. And then finally, again, a distinction with Marx and other socialists is that Gronlund was not an internationalist, at least at first. He believed socialism had to begin in a particular country before expanding to others. So, like his theory of how the power behind evolution raised up key historical figures, it also raised up nations to lead toward the commonwealth. And he believed that it was the US and Great Britain that were destined for such a task. So here you have a socialist who is not about violence. He didn't deny that there was class tension and class hostilities, but he wanted to sort of cool those tensions and encourage cooperative activity. All right. Well, let me quickly finish with the third thing I want to do, and that is, what can we learn from Gronlund today? I think I kind of hinted at it already. There's I think intrinsic value when we correct false views about the past. That's one thing. And especially, my intent in this is to cool or to turn down the temperature um, on the culture wars in the United States. But it's also offered to as an attempt to kind of break a kind of feedback loop in America. America is kind of stuck in a Gilded Age progressive era loop, as I said, um, and the country has been through about four of these cycles, a Gilded Age progressive era cycles, where you have the growth of big wealth, a major economic downturn, and then considerations of, well, how do we prevent this from happening? Again, we see this in the late 19th century. We see, big wealth also in the 1920s, and then of course a crash in the 1930s. after World War II, big boom in wealth. And this also comes around the time of the civil rights movement, which also has its connections to critiques of capitalism. This comes to an end in the 1970s. And then with the ascendancy of conservatism in the 1980s, you have another big boom in wealth, and then the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression in 2008. And I think we're seeing a repeat of history today with Trump's second inaugural second term, but also big wealth behind Donald Trump and kind of pulling the levers of power with someone like the wealthiest man in the world, Elon Musk. So we're moving into another sort of Gilded Age period, and I think during these periods, and even now, Americans have returned to this choice that they have to make, and this was presented by Louis Brandeis. Either we could have the United States can have democracy, or it could have big wealth in the hands of a few. But as Brandeis says, we cannot have both. So we can learn from historical figures like Laurence Gronlund and other socialists. It's not the left is not something to fear. These ideas from socialists like Laurence Gronlund is not something that we have to be so afraid of and fuel the divisions in the country. Well, I've gone over a little bit. I've spoken a little bit too much. I want to spend a little bit time on questions. So I'm going to have some help feeding me some questions. So please send your questions to me now.
Thank you. Our first question here is about a well-known quote, and the quote is, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism," right? And I think that's from Zizek. Question is, how do you sort of think of that quote in relation to this discussion, and how does that sort of factor into some of the topics that you're exploring here?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's to me, it's a motivating question. I think to myself, where can we hide from capitalism? As Marx says, the bourgeois chases every corner of the globe. There's not a square, to borrow a phrase, right? There's not a square inch in the entire cosmos that capitalism doesn't declare mine. But my direct answer to that is, look, we can look at examples in history of resistance to capitalism. Bernard Harcourt has a great book. His latest book, Cooperation, kind of talks about a third way outside of kind of political, the two political channels that we have to deal with capitalism, and that is to really tap into cooperation. Richard Wolff also talks about the value of cooperation. So, I mean, I think the quote is funny. I don't really hold to it dogmatically. And we should also, we should acknowledge the impact that the left has had on the U.S. and kind of reviving this history. I think it would lead us in a better direction.
Thank you. You mentioned at the beginning of this talk that you are zooming in from out of the US. Can you talk about writing this book from China, from another country, sort of from quote unquote the outside, and how that approach sort of changed the way that you wrote the book or thought about some of these questions?
You know, sure. I mean, the first thing that sort of comes to my mind is that, I ride public transportation. Shanghai is one of the best public transportation systems in the world, and I can pull out, Marx's Capital, and not be, confronted by anyone here in China. Uh, there is a sort of a different mindset. There are different types of communism and socialism and things like that. And here, there's heavily influence of Maoism, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping, which is a little bit different um, from New Left Marxism, but yeah, working here, it's kind of enlightening to have different conversations about capitalism and the left. Capitalism is here in China, and it's pretty successful. But what's interesting with China is certainly there's the influence of Maoist communism, but there's a much longer tradition of communalism that's much older than even the history of the United States. So that's kind of interesting to see that. But I think, I mean, there might be something about the fact that getting a job in Shanghai, encouraged me to think about the economy in the United States, and but also the impact of neoliberalism and capitalism on things like higher education. But I haven't really explored much of that. I do teach Western humanities. Um, I do a global studies course. I teach a philosophy course as well. So these issues were with me when I came to China. Like I said, 2008 and also the Occupy movement were really, big motivators for me.
Thank you. Our next question here is from Don in the comment section, sort of asking about the role of unions in this discussion. So how much do unions sort of come up throughout the book? What's their importance? And sort of how are they a factor in all of these questions?
Yeah, good. So um, while Gronlund supported trade unionism, uh, it he well, let me say it this way: the book is really more about Gronlund's ideas. So it's more like an intellectual biography. I do talk a little bit about his opinions about trade unionism. He approaches unions from the perspective of, let's say, a lawyer. And so he talks about things like arbitration and things like that. But he's a little bit distant from it. He was organizing in 1877, and then he just kind of became uh, he pulled away from organizing himself and became more of like a critic, but he was involved in various parties. You got the various splits in the Socialist Party, different strategies, and he was the kind of, his personality was trying to pull individuals together. So, for instance, those that supported um, colonizing efforts setting up cooperative communes throughout the United States, he was supportive of. He was a little bit critical of the sort of political routes among certain socialists, but nonetheless, he tried to kind of pull them together. He was really one chapter of the book, chapter 3, deals with Gronlund's battle with Henry George and George's own party. Henry George was very committed to his program, the single tax program, and he fell out. He really became critical of the socialists, and that led to a kind of hostility between the socialists and the Georgists on the single tax. And Gronlund thought that that was he criticized Henry George, but he was willing to nonetheless work with him. But Henry George didn't seem to want to work with Gronlund or other socialists as well. He was also frustrated with, as I said, political sort of directed socialists like Victor Berger, who had a lot of people had a hard time working with him given his personality. So he seemed to always be in on a level of first of all leadership, and number two, he was more like almost like a circuit evangelist. So
Thank you. Our next question here is about sort of the word socialist and the way that it sort of has a negative connotation in the US and in other places as well. How did you approach that when thinking of titling your book, for example, or sort of the ways that you're sharing this book with the world and the ways that people might react or not react to the negative connotations associated with that label?
right. So yeah, I want us to in getting into this history, I don't want us to be afraid of the term. I mentioned already that early on, in a very general sense, socialist meant, well, in early socialist, in places like England or in Europe, um, generally meant someone who was concerned about the social effect of industrial capitalism. And then it takes on more and more meaning. Um, the most consistent meaning, as I said, was the workers owning the means of production, and owning the means of production relates to um, human flourishing. It goes back to a kind of a classical Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, right? Our ability to, or have the freedom to develop our humanity. And the one way to do that is that we have to do that together. We have to do it collectively. And if we don't have the means to own ourselves, we then can't, we can't pursue things like life and liberty, um, and also happiness. But also socialism, you'll see, especially early on, as I said, even before Gronlund, meant cooperation, right? So I don't think we can, if I can get a little bit philosophical here, I don't think we can have meaning. I don't think we can have development of ourselves without forms of cooperation in whatever sort of mode of life that we're living, our biological lives, our logical lives, our aesthetic lives, even our religious lives. These all overlap, and they require cooperation. So, and I don't see that as something that we should freak out about. Now, most people at least what I've seen, especially those from right-wing media outlets, they throw around these terms, oh, the left and Marxism, oh, and they're socialists. Biden is a socialist, but Biden's not a socialist. But these terms are never, or they're just never defined. Or if they do define it, they say, oh, the socialists and the Marxists, they just want to take all of our property away. Well, as I've already said, Marx would disagree with that, and he calls it crude capitalism. Then he talks about we're not talking about general property, but a form of property, as he talks about in the Communist Manifesto. And then finally, I think we need to recognize, the impact or the what we've received from leftist activities, things like the 8-hour day and workers' comp, the weekend. These these have not been granted, by our capitalist overlords. They've been demanded by those who are producing the value. So I just want us to kind of calm down with the language and get back to history to better understand what these terms are. And when you really understand what these terms mean, I think you'll realize that it's not really all that scary. And so the fear mongering, which is intensified, especially after World War II, of this communist takeover. Oh my goodness, a communism is first of all, there are already co-ops around the world and in the United States. So if communism is in America, well, you can find communist communes, but they're not something to be feared, other than I guess by those who are ignorant of the history. Sorry,
Thank you.
that was kind of a strong statement, but I think we do need to confront ignorance in the country for the purposes of. I think America is kind of almost irrevocably divided, and it's getting worse, and it doesn't need to be that way. And I think studying history and philosophy and activities like this will find that these things are really nothing to fear. Another response is that we're afraid that socialism, it's going to be violent, it's going to kill people. And well, Gronlund was a pacifist, and there were plenty of other socialists who said violence is not the way to go. But this, of course, ignores the degrees of discipline and violence inherent to capitalism itself.
Thank you. Our last question is about what you are working on now. Will your next project be very similar to this or different? What's next?
So I have a couple things that I'm working on. What I'd like to do is I'd like to do a survey of cooperative activity in the United States. The sort of early Owenite communities, the Fourierist communities, and the intellectual underpinnings of that, the support of the transcendentalists, etc., all the way to communes like Twin Oaks in Virginia. That's kind of a larger project, but one other project that I'm kind of deep into right now, so I've done a lot of work on it. I'm actually going back to anti-slavery. I'm moving back to the antebellum period, and I'm doing a work that traces the origins of philosophy in the United States, or the origins of American philosophy through the fight against slavery. So, putting aside the influence of Jonathan Edwards for a moment and the transcendentalists, classical American philosophy really begins after the war. I'm trying to move that history to before the war. Okay, so yeah, so the way in which the fight against slavery was a, if you will, maybe I'll say it in a bold way, was also a philosophical movement and a major chapter in the history of philosophy in America. So those are the two works that I'm working on right now.
Thank you so much. Well, that was our last question, so we can go ahead and say thanks and goodbye to the audience.
Thank you so much.